This is the story of Jehosheba, a princess, a protector, and a woman whose quiet courage saved a future king. She never led armies or built cities, but her one secret act of bravery changed the destiny of a nation. While others bowed to fear, she stood in the shadows and chose to act. This is a story about risk, rescue, and a hidden baby who would carry a kingdom's hope. Because one brave action can protect generations. The palace garden was silent, too silent for a place filled with roses and fountains. Even the birds seemed to know what was coming. Under the first light of dawn, Jehosheba moved through the mist like a shadow, her robe brushing against dew-covered stones. She wasn't dressed like a princess this morning, no gold pins, no purple trim, only a plain cloak, dark and quiet. The air smelled of myrrh and danger. And time was running out. Beyond the garden walls, the city of Jerusalem was waking up slowly. But inside the palace, fear already had a head start. Queen Athaliah had claimed the throne just days before, and with it, she declared something far more terrifying than war. She would destroy the entire royal family, every child, every heir, every hope for David's line. Jehosheba's heart beat like a drum beneath her cloak. There was still one child left, a baby, Joash. He was her nephew, too young to speak, too small to understand the danger closing in on him like a tide. But she understood. And she would not stand still. Years ago, before fear ruled the palace, Jehosheba had been just another royal daughter. Raised in quiet corridors, taught to serve and stay silent. Her father, King Jehoram, had ruled with violence. Her stepmother, Athaliah, had ruled with venom. But there was another voice in her life, one that had shaped her in ways the court never saw. Jehoiada, the priest. Her husband, a man of wisdom, strength, and devotion to the God of Israel. He taught her not just scripture, but courage, not just prayer, but action. And now, those lessons would be tested in the highest court of Judah and in the lowest chamber of the palace. She reached the outer corridor where the guards' footsteps echoed just as they changed shifts. Jehosheba pressed herself against the wall, waited for the silence between footsteps, and slipped through a narrow servants' hall. No one looked her way. No one suspected the king's daughter was planning a rescue. In a dark corner near the nursery, a nursemaid waited, eyes wide, arms trembling, and inside those arms was Joash. Jehosheba took the child without a word, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she was. And still, she moved forward. The tunnel entrance wasn't marked, no map, no torch, no door, only a single uneven flagstone hidden behind a curtain in the linen storeroom, a forgotten corner of the palace Jehosheba had memorized when she was barely 12. She dropped to her knees, her arms wrapped tightly around the baby. Joash didn't cry. Not yet. Just a soft whimper, as if even he could feel the weight of the moment pressing in like stone. "Please," she whispered, rocking him gently. "Just a little longer." With a careful shove, she lifted the slab, old, heavy, dust-covered. Underneath, a hole just wide enough for one person and one small hope. She took a breath, pulled the baby close, and slipped down into darkness. Above, the palace roared to life. Not with music or feasting, with shouting. Steel on stone. Athaliah had begun. Guards stormed the royal nursery. Doors were thrown open. Cradles overturned, cloaks dragged off sleeping children as names were called out and bloodlines examined. One child screamed. A woman shouted, "You can't do this!" And Athaliah's voice, sharp as broken glass, cut through it all. "Let none of the royal seed survive." Jehosheba crouched in the tunnel, breath shallow, sweat slick on her forehead. Dust clung to her lips. The baby stirred against her chest. He was so small, so quiet, so unaware that his name had just become the most dangerous one in Judah. The tunnel led beneath the west wing, behind the servant kitchens, and up through a hatch only Jehoiada had access to into the temple courts. Safe, but not yet. Each step was slower than the last. Joash squirmed. A tiny noise escaped his lips. Jehosheba froze. Above them, footsteps echoed through the stone, closer, closer. And then silence. For a full minute, Jehosheba didn't move, didn't breathe. Then a bird sang above her, sweet and sudden, and she dared to take one step more. When she reached the hidden door beneath the temple gate, it was already cracked open. Jehoiada stood there, cloaked in white linen, eyes wide with worry. "Is he alive?" he whispered. Jehosheba stepped forward, trembling. "He is." Jehoiada gently took the child in his arms and pressed his forehead to the baby's. Then he looked at his wife, the royal daughter turned rescuer. "You understand what you've done?" Jehosheba didn't answer right away. She looked back toward the palace, the halls she had grown up in, the garden where she'd once played, the chambers now filled with screams. Then she looked down at Joash, and she nodded. "I've done what needed to be done." The temple was never silent. Even at night, when the crowds were gone and the priests had finished their rituals, there was still a hum in the walls, like the stones remembered every prayer ever whispered within them. Jehosheba walked those halls now with soft steps and careful eyes. Behind a carved cedar panel near the chamber of incense, hidden from every worshiper and every priest except one, a child slept beneath layers of linen. Joash, safe for now. Jehoiada stood nearby, reading from an old scroll by oil lamp light. His face looked older this week, creased with more than time. He glanced toward the child, then toward his wife. "We'll raise him in the courts," he said quietly. "He'll learn the law before he learns to speak." Jehosheba nodded. "And when the time comes." Jehoiada didn't look up. "Then God will decide." Outside the temple gates, Athaliah reigned like a lioness with a throne, bold, brutal, unquestioned. She filled the city with her symbols, replaced the sacred vessels, ordered pagan carvings where the words of Moses once stood. Her advisors wore robes stained with foreign incense. Her soldiers bowed not in prayer, but in profit. And no one dared whisper about what had happened to the royal children, not out loud. But Jehosheba heard the questions behind the quiet stairs. Back inside the temple, Joash began to grow, faster than they expected. He rolled over on his own, reached for the lamp, laughed at shadows, and every giggle made Jehosheba's heart both lighter and heavier. "Soon," Jehoiada whispered one evening, brushing Joash's hair back from his forehead, "soon, the world will know you're alive." Jehosheba watched them, priest and prince, side by side. "How long can we wait?" she asked. "As long as we must." That night she crept into the outer court and sat beneath the bronze pillars. The stars stretched wide above her, clear and burning. She hadn't seen the palace in months, hadn't worn her royal colors, hadn't spoken her full name aloud, but none of that mattered, because she hadn't just saved a baby, she had saved a lineage, a covenant, a future. And every time Joash opened his eyes, she remembered why she had risked everything. Joash was 5 the first time he sang too loud. It was a simple melody, something the Levites had taught him during their daily recitations. He had been hiding behind a tapestry, pretending to be a priest like Jehoiada, waving a wooden stick as if it were a scepter. "Praise be to the Lord, King of Israel, forever and ever," he sang in a voice much too bold. Jehosheba dropped her scroll. Mira, the temple maid, froze mid-step. Jehoiada stepped out of the shadows like thunder with a finger to his lips. "Not so loud, little one," he said, crouching low beside the child. Joash tilted his head. "Why?" "Because not everyone is ready to hear who you are." Later, when the boy had gone to sleep, Jehosheba stood beside the curtain that concealed his room and let out the breath she'd been holding since morning. "He doesn't understand," she whispered. "He shouldn't have to," Jehoiada replied. "But that's what evil does. It forces children to carry secrets meant for kings." Outside the temple, Athaliah's rule had only grown tighter. She demanded more sacrifices to Baal. She ordered statues placed near the city gates, some so tall they blocked the morning sun. And she listened more closely now, to whispers, to rumors, to anything that suggested the old royal line wasn't as dead as she'd declared. One afternoon, Jehosheba heard murmuring near the outer court. 2 market women were haggling with a spice seller when one of them said too loudly, "There's a boy in the temple who looks like the old king's brother." Jehosheba stepped forward calmly, not rushing, not panicking. She laid a hand on the woman's shoulder. "That's my nephew's child," she said evenly. "He lives in Hebron. People see what they want when they stare too long at shadows." The woman flushed, muttered something, and moved on. But Jehosheba's heart hammered in her chest. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat beside Joash's bed, watching him dream. He muttered in his sleep, still practicing his songs. Her hands gripped the edge of the straw mat. "What if we can't keep him hidden?" she asked. Jehoiada answered from the doorway. "Then we'll teach him to stand before the time comes. And if it comes too soon, then God will stand for him." For the first time, Jehosheba wept. Not because she was afraid, but because she was tired of secrets, of shadows, of pretending not to love the child like her own. But when morning came, she was on her feet again. Because bravery isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just showing up again. The sun climbed higher over Jerusalem, bathing the temple courts in gold. It should have felt peaceful, but Jehosheba knew better. There was a new presence in the court that morning, unfamiliar, quiet, and far too observant. The man didn't wear a soldier's uniform. He wore a scribe's robe, thin, silver-trimmed, a scroll case at his side. But his eyes scanned everything, not the scriptures, but the people. He was watching the Levites, watching the offerings, watching the children. And every time Joash passed nearby, his gaze lingered just a second too long. Jehosheba moved quickly, intercepting the boy near the well. "Thirsty?" she asked. Joash nodded, not noticing her tense expression. As he drank, she turned her body slightly, blocking the stranger's line of sight. "Time to go inside," she said, guiding Joash by the shoulder. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked. "No," she said. But not everyone who comes to worship comes for God. She found Jehoiada in the priest's quarters, his hands covered in incense ash. "There's a man in the outer court," she said. "Tall, thin, pretending to read. He's watching." "Baal's priests again?" "Maybe. Or worse, one of hers." Jehoiada didn't need to ask who she meant. Athaliah's eyes were everywhere now. But if she had sent someone into the temple, that meant suspicion. That meant time was running out. That night, after the temple gates closed and the torches were lit, Jehosheba and Jehoiada met in the upper chamber above the treasury. Joash slept below, his arms wrapped around a rolled-up linen scroll like it was a toy. "He's getting too old to be hidden forever," Jehoiada said. "He's only 6, Jehosheba whispered. "He's still learning to tie his own sandals." "But he's also learning to speak truth," Jehoiada replied, "to recite the covenant, to name the kings of Israel." He paused. "To carry a crown." Jehosheba leaned against the stone wall, staring at the flickering shadows on the ceiling. "What if he's not ready?" "He won't be alone," Jehoiada said. She looked down at her hands, hands that once held the child when he was barely bigger than a loaf of bread. "He was never mine," she said, "but I love him like he is." Jehoiada nodded. "So do I." Below them, Joash stirred in his sleep and whispered something into the stillness. "Lord, help me be brave." Jehosheba's eyes filled with tears because the child was already braver than she'd ever known. The letter arrived at the temple gates at midday. No seal, no greeting, just a simple command written in the queen's sharp, angular hand. "The queen will visit the temple to inspect the treasury. Prepare accordingly. Athaliah." Jehosheba read it twice, then once more. Not because she didn't understand, but because she couldn't believe the words stayed so calm when the threat behind them screamed so loud. "She's coming," she told Jehoiada. He closed his eyes, slow and steady. "How soon?" 3 days. 3 days. 3 days to clean every corner, to hide every trace, to prepare Joash all over again. But there was no tunnel left to run through. No place lower to hide. Joash was no longer an infant cradled in silence. He was a boy, a living promise. And if Athaliah's eyes landed on his face, it would all be over. Jehosheba stood in the upper court that evening, watching the sun paint the city walls with light. Joash ran through the halls below, a carved wooden lion in his hands. He had made it himself, sanded smooth and painted with oils. "Look," he called, "it's the Lion of Judah." Jehosheba smiled, but her chest ached. He didn't even know yet. He was the lion. That night, Jehoiada gathered the inner circle of priests. 7 trusted men, 7 pairs of eyes that had seen enough injustice to know when to act and when to wait. "She'll walk the courts," Jehoiada said. "She'll examine the treasury, but she will not touch the boy." "If she suspects anything?" "She will see only what we show her," Jehosheba said firmly. "No more." On the morning of the queen's arrival, the temple gleamed, not with gold, but with precision. The priests moved in careful rhythm. The gates opened with perfect timing. The incense burned pure and clean, veiling the air like smoke over still water. And Joash? He waited in a hidden chamber, deep behind the altar, watched by Mira and two trusted guards. Athaliah entered in silence. She didn't wear mourning clothes. She wore black velvet and a crown, one she had stolen. Her gaze was sharp, suspicious. She said nothing for several long moments, just walked and watched, and turned her head slightly toward the back halls. Jehosheba stood tall, hands folded. Would the queen care to examine the offering scales? Athaliah's eyes didn't blink. Her voice was smooth as stone. I care to see everything. Jehosheba led her through the treasury, past the pillars, around the basin. She answered every question without trembling. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because her heart was anchored in something stronger. At last Athaliah turned to leave, but just before she crossed the gate, she paused. She looked over her shoulder and said, "Strange. I feel like I've forgotten something." Then she left. Jehosheba didn't breathe until the gate closed behind her. Then she knelt and whispered, "Lord, not yet, but soon." The wind shifted that morning, not like a storm, not like a breeze, like a turning point. Something ancient and holy stirred in the air above the temple gates. Jehosheba could feel it. So could Joash. He was 7 now, still small for his age, but his eyes had grown deep, like they held more history than a child should carry. He had learned the scrolls by heart. He could name every king of Judah in order, and he had heard the stories, how his grandmother, Athaliah, had tried to end his line before it began. But he also knew something else. He was the son of David, and one day he would wear the crown. Jehoiada called the household together before sunrise. His voice was steady, but there was fire beneath it. "The time has come," he said. Jehosheba listened, one hand resting on Joash's shoulder. "The people have forgotten," Jehoiada continued, "but God has not. The throne belongs to the house of David, and this boy is the rightful king." One of the Levites gasped. Another said, "But in the temple? That's suicide." "She will kill us all," said another. Jehoiada's voice cut through their panic. "She will try, but the Lord will stand for us if we stand for what's right." He explained the plan in quiet detail. The guards would be stationed at the gates, swords drawn, trained and waiting. The Levites would circle the altar. The trumpet would sound when the crown touched the boy's head, and the people, they would be watching. Jehosheba spoke next. "If we wait any longer, Athaliah's grip will never break. But if we act now, if we are united, the city will remember whose name still matters." Joash looked up at her. "Will she come?" he asked. Jehosheba knelt beside him. "Yes," she said gently, "but you don't have to be afraid." "Why not?" She smiled. "Because you're not standing alone." The sun rose higher, painting the temple gold. Priests moved into place, guards took their stations. The courtyard began to fill. At first, just a few murmuring elders, then merchants, then shepherds, then mothers with children on their hips, all drawn by a strange sense that something was about to change. Joash stood in the inner court, wrapped in a white robe, a crown resting in Jehoiada's trembling hands. Jehosheba stood behind them, breath caught between fear and faith. And then Jehoiada lifted the crown. The trumpet blew. The courtyard froze. Then, cheers, shouts, cries of, "Long live the king!" The secret was no longer a secret. The prince was no longer hidden. And somewhere in the palace, Athaliah heard the sound and screamed. The cries of the people echoed through Jerusalem like thunder rolling across the hills. "Long live the king! Joash, son of David, our king lives." In the temple courtyard, the Levites stood tall, swords drawn. Jehoiada placed the crown gently on Joash's head, and Joash, barely taller than the altar itself, stood still, wide-eyed, the robe hanging too long on his shoulders. But somehow, he looked like he'd been born for that moment. Jehosheba stood behind him, hands clasped, heart pounding with the rhythm of prophecy fulfilled. But in the palace, Athaliah was not silent. The shriek that tore from her throat was not just rage. It was recognition. She knew the sound of that trumpet. She had heard it once before, years ago, when her father Ahab was crowned, and now it echoed again. Not for her, not for her son, but for a child she had failed to kill. She didn't wait for guards. She didn't summon soldiers. She tore her cloak at the shoulder, grabbed a blade from the wall, and stormed out of the palace herself, barefoot, wild-eyed, robe flying behind her like a shadow of wrath. Jehosheba saw her coming long before the others did. The crowd parted. Some gasped. Others backed away. But Jehosheba did not move. She stood at Joash's side as the queen entered the temple courtyard, breathless, shaking, and snarling. "Treason!" Athaliah bellowed, voice splitting the air. "Treason!" Joash flinched, but Jehoiada stepped forward calmly, hand raised. "This is no rebellion," he said. "This is restoration." "You dare crown him while I still rule?" "You never ruled," Jehoiada replied. "You only reigned." Athaliah's eyes darted to Joash, and for one heartbeat, even she seemed shaken. The boy looked just like his father, Ahaziah. Same eyes, same stance. Her sword lowered just a little. "You can't do this," she hissed. Jehosheba finally spoke. "We already have." The guards moved swiftly. They didn't strike her in the temple. No blood was spilled in the house of the Lord. But they seized her arms and led her out through the horse gate. The people didn't cheer. They watched, silent, resolute. Because justice doesn't always shout. It sometimes bows its head and breathes again. Joash stood still. And for the first time, the people looked at him not as a child, but as a king. The sun rose slowly over Jerusalem that morning. The shadows that had stretched across the city for 6 long years began to shrink, pushed back not by armies, but by truth. The trumpet was quiet now. So were the people. But something stronger than noise had taken root, conviction. They had seen the boy. They had heard the crown proclaimed. They had watched the queen dragged through the gates. And now their hearts were asking a question. What do we do with what's left? Joash was seated in the outer court, still too small for the royal chair they'd placed there. His legs dangled above the floor, swinging nervously. But he sat tall, eyes focused, as if the weight of the crown had straightened his spine. Jehosheba stood nearby, hands resting on the hilt of the ceremonial staff. Jehoiada addressed the people. "For 6 years," he said, his voice strong and clear, "we lived under a lie." The crowd didn't speak. "But the Lord has preserved the seed of David, just as he promised." Murmurs of agreement spread. "And now We must do what's right in his eyes. He raised his hand. Tear down the altars of Baal, burn the idols, remove the priests of darkness from this land. No one moved at first. Then one elder stepped forward, then 2, then 20. And within the hour the city moved. Like a wave of righteousness, the people spread through the streets, not with rage, but with purpose. Statues were toppled. Altars smashed, incense stands destroyed. Even the temple of Baal, once guarded, feared, and dripping with stolen offerings, was reduced to rubble and ash. Jehosheba stood with Joash at the temple gates, watching the smoke rise in the distance. He reached for her hand. She gave it freely. "Why were they ever built?" he asked. Jehosheba looked out over the city. "Because people forgot who they belonged to," she said, "but not anymore." Jehoiada approached quietly. "It's beginning," he said, "not just the rule of a king, but the healing of a nation." Jehosheba glanced down at the boy beside her. He still held the staff. He still wore a robe too long. But his eyes were steady, and his hand in hers no longer trembled, because the boy who had once been hidden in shadows now stood in the light. The throne room echoed now, not with fear, not with war, but with footsteps and scrolls. Joash sat on a small platform carved from cedar, his hands pressed together, listening as the law of Moses was read aloud to him each morning. Jehosheba watched from a distance, behind the curtain, always present, always quiet. She didn't speak unless asked, but when he glanced her way, she was always there. "I didn't know kings had to learn so much," Joash said one day, groaning as another scroll was placed in front of him. Jehosheba smiled. "The best kings don't just wear crowns, they carry wisdom." "What if I forget some of it?" She walked closer, gently tapping his temple. "Then remember this first. The Lord your God is the true king. You are his servant." The boy nodded, serious, then yawned. Jehosheba chuckled. "Finish the scroll, then Mira will bring dates and honey." Outside the palace, not everyone rejoiced, not everyone celebrated. Some old officials, once loyal to Athaliah, still whispered in the corners of the market, still bowed at foreign altars in secret, still longed for the days when gold flowed faster than justice. Jehosheba knew this. She had seen the look in their eyes. Change had come, yes, but peace was still growing roots. And the deeper those roots reached, the more protection Joash would need, not from swords, but from seduction, from pride, from the slow, creeping pull of power. That evening, Jehoiada found her in the upper hall. He handed her a fresh scroll. "A copy of the covenant," he said, "for him to keep in his chambers." She ran her hand over the parchment. "He's only 7. Jehoiada smiled. "So were others when God began his work in them." She looked at him. "Do you think I was brave or just desperate?" He stepped beside her. "I think you were both. But what matters is you were faithful. And now, so must he be." That night, Joash placed the scroll beside his bed. He didn't touch his carved lion. He didn't ask for extra stories. He simply whispered, "God of my fathers, make me strong and wise." Jehosheba stood in the doorway, hand to her heart. Because what she had hidden once in fear, she now watched grow in faith. It began with a coin. A single silver piece dropped on the palace floor, shiny, fresh, and stamped with a foreign king's face. Joash picked it up after a council meeting and turned it slowly in the light. "This isn't ours," he said. Jehosheba, watching from the side, moved quickly. She took the coin from his hand and pressed it into a cloth pouch. "Who had this?" she asked. Joash shook his head. "I don't know. One of the elders, maybe a visitor." But the coin was only the beginning. Later that week, a scribe found a message behind a loose stone in the treasury wall. No name, no seal, just a question written in dark, rushed ink. "If the boy is truly king, why does the council still bow to the priest?" Jehosheba read it with a still face, but inside her heart stirred. Jehoiada was aging. His voice was softer now, his steps slower. And some in the court had begun to whisper, "Shouldn't the boy rule alone? Doesn't he need new counselors now? Perhaps someone younger, someone less bound by the old ways?" Jehoiada heard the rumors too. "I expected this," he said, rolling a scroll with steady fingers. When light shines long enough, jealous eyes begin to squint. Jehosheba stood by the window watching Joash train with wooden swords in the courtyard below. "They'll try to split us from him," she said. "They'll try," Jehoiada agreed, "but the boy has truth in him." Still, they watched and waited, because evil didn't always attack with swords. Sometimes it smiled in the council chamber. A new advisor was appointed. His name was Kelar. Well-spoken, polished, generous with praise, he bowed deeply, gave gifts freely, too freely. And Joash, eager to prove himself, welcomed the man into his circle. Jehosheba didn't trust him. She saw the flattery in his eyes, the way he asked leading questions. "Do you ever wish to make your own decisions, my king? Wouldn't it be faster to collect taxes without the temple's oversight? Surely you don't need priests to build palaces." One day, Joash asked her, "Aunt, do you think I'm old enough to lead on my own?" Jehosheba didn't answer right away. She looked at the boy, no longer small, no longer timid, and she said, "You're old enough to lead, but not old enough to forget who gave you the crown." Joash looked away, and she saw it then, the tension. Between youth and wisdom, between listening and leading, between gratitude and pride. That night, she prayed longer than usual. "Lord," she whispered, "don't let the light we fought to protect be stolen by shadows again. Because it wasn't enough to save a generation. Now, she had to teach it how to stand." The palace was busier than usual. Couriers came and went with rolled maps, construction scrolls, and fresh ink. New plans, new taxes, new ideas. Joash stood tall now, taller than Jehosheba had imagined he'd be when she carried him through the tunnel years ago. His voice was deeper, his gaze sharper, and yet he still fidgeted with the edge of his royal sash when he was unsure. Kelar was beside him more often now, speaking softly, suggesting boldly, smiling constantly. Jehosheba sat alone near the outer garden, her hands folded in her lap. Jehoiada had passed away in his sleep only weeks earlier. The temple bells had rung, the people had mourned, and now the shift had begun. Without Jehoiada's voice, the king's circle had grown wider and noisier. That afternoon, Joash came to her, His robe trailed behind him like a shadow too long for the light. "I've decided to rebuild the upper palace," he said. Jehosheba nodded slowly. "And the temple repairs?" "They'll wait." She tilted her head. "Why?" "The people want celebration," he said. "And Kalar says a strong palace means a strong nation." Jehosheba said nothing for a long time. Then, "Do you remember what we fought for?" Joash didn't answer. She stood, walked to a chest near the cedar wall, and pulled from it a tiny, dust-covered object, a child's wooden lion. The one he carved when he was 6. She placed it in his hands. "You were born to carry more than gold," she said gently. "You were saved for more than walls." Joash stared at it, suddenly quiet. "I don't want to lose what we've built," he said. "Then protect the foundation," she whispered, "not the paint." The next day, the temple repairs resumed. The people noticed, and they remembered. Because while Jehoiada's voice had faded, Jehosheba's courage still echoed in the king's heart. Years later, long after her hair had turned silver and her steps had slowed, Jehosheba sat in the temple court and listened as the people sang, "Blessed be the Lord who remembered his promise, who raised a child from the shadows and gave a crown to courage." She didn't need applause. She didn't need a statue, because her reward was already written in stone, in scroll, in legacy, and in the life of the boy she once carried in the dark. One brave action, one hidden prince, one faithful woman. A kingdom saved. Faithful woman. A kingdom saved.